This presentation is about the role of populism and political parties in Greece. And I'm going to contrast the case of Greece with the case of Portugal. This is in order to raise 2 points. The first point is that while populism is a well-known concept, it is usually understood as a movement or an ideology on the way to ascend to power. Whereas I would submit to you, and this is my first point, that populism should also be understood as a mode of governing after a populist party arrives in government. And also my second point will be that the fact that Greece, in contrast to Portugal, has experienced populism, at least over a number of years. This is related to several factors which exist in Greece, but not in the case of Portugal. These factors have to do with political culture, by which I particularly mean a tendency to resist authority. And secondly, the fact that in Greece we have a very polarized political party system. And thirdly, the impact of the recent economic crisis, which has been indeed the last cause for the emergence of populism. So here's the outline of my presentation. I will go very quickly through different approaches to populism, emphasizing one of those. Then I will discuss state-society relations. I will compare how austerity was implemented in Greece, in contrast to Portugal. And then I will distinguish between right-wing and left-wing populism. I will emphasize, as already mentioned, party systems and anti-austerity protests and political culture in the two countries. And then I will move to the topic of populist government policies before I conclude. So populism is basically an ideology. This is the dominant theory now in the relevant academic bibliography. Most people use the definitions offered by Cas Mudde, and I have the references at the very last line of this slide. Populism understands society in dualistic terms, and it pits people against enemies. These may be national enemies or foreign enemies. For example, foreign elites or foreign nations, or the incoming people, such as people who come in as refugees or migrants. Populism claims that the citizens of a certain country have been deprived of the right to rule. And then that is a major step here. Populism says that people are morally superior to elites and to all its enemies, and thus one should understand that the people need someone to represent them. This is the populist party or the populist leader. It is, in the words of Cas Mudde, a thin ideology. It does not possess the full set of ideas and values you find in other ideologies, such as liberalism or socialism. It is combined for this reason with other more developed ideologies of the kind I mentioned. And I'm making my first point, namely that this definition and other definitions which emphasize the role of charismatic leadership or the role of people mobilizing in the form of social movements stop at a certain point, and this is a time point. This is the time point of the populist party rising to government. However, it is high time now that there are many populist governments around the world to include in our definition of populism elements of the performance of populist governments. And I would like to suggest that there are several such elements, including a distrust towards checks and balances. For instance, checks and balances among the parliament, the judiciary, and the government in illiberal democracies. The colonization of the state, by which we mean the massive staffing of public administration and the public sector with supporters and members of the populist party. Clientelism, which is a very well-known concept. We use it interchangeably with patronage. Economic nationalism and protectionism in economic policy, followed by populist governments. Skepticism or hostility towards the euro, if we talk about populist governments in European Union democracies, and a very traditional understanding of security. So perhaps for the discussion, I will leave the question open whether populism is, after all, a thin ideology or not. Moving to the legacies of the Greek state-society relations, I will be very brief. You all have heard of the different approaches to the way Greek state-society relations have evolved over time. Svoronos underlines the fact that for a long time, Greeks resisted all kinds of authority, national or foreign. There are also historical legacies of political patronage and populism, and these are not brand new. They existed already in the 20th century, if you follow the argument made by Mouzelis. And then Greece had an experience with populism back in the decade of the 1980s. There are some important trends in state-society relations which influence Greek politics. There is a long-term political apathy. I know this may come as a surprise to people, given the hostility which one sees in the contemporary Greek political scene. Yet, we know from political research that since the late 1980s in Greece, as in other countries, there is a rise in political apathy and in political cynicism. And in fact, also in Greece, over the last decade, we see a decline in the number of people who show up to vote in elections. We also have the familiar long-term inefficiency of the Greek bureaucracy, as well as phenomena which are very familiar to all of you: poor governance, corruption, and discrimination against political opponents, including also mistreatment of some groups of the population, in the sense that there is discrimination, for instance, against women, or discrimination against outsiders of the labor market, for example, very young people. To conclude, there is also a long-term divergence between education and on the one hand, and labor market opportunities. So many people have the educational credentials, but cannot find a decent job. Now, I will just go through these very well-known causes of the economic crisis. In the years between 2008 and 2011, there was a global financial crisis. There were asymmetries. Still, one can find asymmetries today in the Eurozone between the Northern European member states and the Southern European member states. And there are long-term domestic problems of economy and governance in South European countries such as Portugal, Spain, Italy, and certainly Greece. However, the catalyst effect for the crisis in Southern Europe was the Greek crisis, which created, as you know, a spillover effect. Then we have the familiar reaction, namely international markets feared that Greece would not be able to service its debt. Indeed, Greece in the winter of 2009-2010 faced this prospect. It came close to paying salaries and pensions and was at the brink of sovereign default. The international institutions responded by offering rescue packages to Greece, accompanied by constraints. These were constraints on fiscal policy, but also constraints in policy making in other fields, such as labor policy, educational policy, public administration policy. So there was a critical juncture. While support came to Greece and 3 memoranda of understanding followed in the years between 2010 and 2015, an avalanche phenomenon occurred in the Greek society and economy. The bailout packages helped saving the country from sovereign default, but also created, unfortunately, very negative effects. For example, as you see on the right-hand side of your screen, unemployment rate soared to almost 28% in Greece. That was far above other countries, including Spain, which traditionally has had high unemployment for several decades. And the poverty rate in Greece was certainly far above the levels of the other countries by the year 2013, which many people consider to be the year in which the crisis peaked. Reactions were also familiar. In the span of 5 years in Greece, between 2010 and 2014, there were 42 general strikes. This was quite unusual. There were also sectoral level strikes. For example, strikes organized by groups of employees or groups of liberal professions. And then there were social movements such as the indignant people, the won't pay movement, and so on and so forth. So for historians of populism, this created a soil fertile for the rise of populism. If you consider how Greece differs from Portugal, by looking at this slide, you will see that while all these protests and reactions occurred in Greece, some of which were plausible exactly because of the great dip in the living standards, in Portugal, something else was happening. The major parties, the center-right PSD and the center-left PS, agreed on fiscal consolidation. And then there was agreement, as I will show later, also with one of the two major Portuguese labor union confederations to proceed with some spending cuts. So there was polarization in Greece from the first moment. There was no such a polarization in Portugal. That has also to do with the story I'm telling you in this slide. There was a replacement of the center-right political party in Portugal in the year 2015, but no populist policies followed after the Socialist Party under Antonio Costa rose to power in Lisbon. In Greece, before 2015, formerly existing parties, Syriza and Golden Dawn, became much stronger. After the elections of 2015, a coalition of populist parties came to power, Syriza and the right-wing nationalist party, ANEL. Let me rush to say that the fact that Syriza is a populist party has been acknowledged by all kinds of commentators, including commentators on the right hand and the left hand of the political spectrum. So in Greece, we had the formation of a short-lived technocratic government. In Portugal, there was no such a need. In Greece, there was a rise of right-wing and left-wing populism, but not so in Portugal. And I mentioned also the difference regarding the existence of populist parties in Greece, but not in Portugal. And the Portuguese political party includes a left-wing party, the Bloco party, which is radical left. And that means that it is close to Syriza, or used to be close to Syriza regarding its political program, but the Bloco party did not adopt a populist rhetoric or populist measures. So in Greece, there was a decline of the traditional mainstream parties, while in Portugal, there was a limited phenomenon of such decline. Let me also go through this slide, which reminds you that in Greece, we have two important, albeit now extinct, populist parties. One is the Golden Dawn, the other is the ANEL. The Golden Dawn party was a former neo-Nazi organization. It became the third largest party in the Greek parliament elections of 2015. That was unheard of in European politics. The party increased its share of total vote in a stark fashion between 2012 and 2015, and it was eclipsed, as you know, in the very last elections of 2019. The Independent Greeks was a party which was a split-off party from the New Democracy ranks. It also obtained an 11% of the vote, quite a large percentage, but then started declining and finally left politics in the year 2019. So what is left-wing policy? Populism, I'm sorry. Syriza is a radical left party consisting of former hardliners of the Communist Party, but also other members of the former KK Interior Party and members of the extra parliamentary left, as well as old-fashioned members of the populist factions of PASOK in the 1980s. It had a very small electoral influence before the crisis. Its electoral influence soared afterwards. Its political discourse, which is important to understand populism, was anti-elite, Eurosceptic, anti-capitalist, and that was reflected in the statement offered by Syriza's leaders. So under Professor Papadimos, there was a technocratic government, and the leader of Syriza announced once that some Greeks are not that Greek, and these are those who govern us. That was an attack against the technocratic prime minister. Then Syriza's political rhetoric included the themes which I note here, such as us versus them, the corrupt elite, and then the statement that the heads of North European EU member states are gangsters. Thus, I think you have some evidence showing that the populist element of pitting the people against national and foreign elites is present when one studies Syriza. These are familiar, I think, events here. I'm just summarizing for you what happened in the elections in Greece, but it's important to note that the Greek party system was shaken. Look at how many parties came and then went in these years of turbulence. By contrast, in Portugal, the very same parties existed before, during, and after the crisis. There were very few instances of small new Portuguese parties, and they did not actually survive. So overall, what we see is that Greece, at the point of the start of the crisis, was doing better than Portugal. After the crisis, Portugal does better than Greece. How do we show this? You look at the numbers showing the per capita income before and after the crisis. So in the year 2017, Greece trailed behind Portugal regarding GDP per capita. The share of people in facing the risk of poverty or social exclusion was higher in Greece than in Portugal, and that situation improved a bit after 2015, but not much. Why there was populism in Greece but not in Portugal? So I summarize here my second point. Compared to Portugal, in Greece, there is more acute and also personal party system polarization. In Portugal, there was a change within the system, not a change of the party system itself. In Portugal, you have less strong labor mobilization. In Greece, there is frequent and strong labor mobilization. And in Greece, you have lower and continue, in Greece, you have higher, Greece, you have higher and continuous distrust towards major political institutions. These are the government, the parliament, and political parties. This is shown by data that is provided by the Eurobarometer. Here is a table showing what I called acute political party polarization. Most Greeks voted for only two parties across a number of years, certainly between 2004 and 2009. There was such a phenomenon in Portugal, but it was much less significant, as you see in this table. The party system polarization after the onset of the crisis continued. All Greek parties rejected the first memorandum of understanding, including conservative parties such as New Democracy. In Portugal, nothing of the sort happened. There was a tacit consent, at least, between the government and the opposition to proceed with some austerity. All labor unions in Greece rejected the memorandum of understanding, and there were many movements of the kind I already talked about against austerity. In Portugal, the memorandum of understanding was rejected by one labor confederation, but there was an agreement between the other labor confederation on the one hand, and the government. There were strikes, but five, not 42, 5 general strikes between 2010 and 2013. So the anti-austerity mobilization in Greece was much stronger than in Portugal, and this reflects a long tradition. So between the earlier years, between 1980 and 2006, among all 71 general strikes organized in the 15 first member states of the European Union, 34 out of these 71 general strikes had taken place in Greece. In addition, in Greece, we had political violence. This political violence involved physical attacks against the government buildings and politicians, as well as, one must admit, brutal force exerted by the police against protesters in the streets of Athens. In Portugal, there were demonstrations, but there were few, and there was no kind of the political violence we have seen in the case of Greece. The Greek labor movement was quite strong, stronger in Greece than in Portugal, as this slide shows. And here are 3 slides in a row. Here I show to you how political trust declines over time, starting from the year 2001 and going to the year 2015. The light blue line is the case of Greece. The other lines in this graph are representing cases of other South European countries. So trust towards the national government plummeted in Greece after 2009. Trust towards the national parliament also declined very sharply in Greece and other countries, as shown in this slide. And here is trust towards political parties. The light blue line again shows the case of Greece. Look at how low was the trust towards political parties in Greece after 2010. The government turnover in Greece and Portugal occurred in the same time. The events are very well known to you, the change of 2015. But there was another change also in Portugal in November 2015. A socialist and radical left government rose to power. There was a referendum which provoked further polarization in the country in Greece. There was no such a referendum in Portugal. The government in Portugal restored previously cut salaries and pensions, but to compensate for this, it decreased public investment and gave subsidies and tax breaks to businessmen. The populist policies I was talking to you about can be seen after the year 2015 in Greece. There was a new law on local government in this country, in Greece, which allowed for referenda to take place at the municipal level and also included regulations of a new electoral system on electing mayors. This new system at the local government level included proportional representation. That is a system that allows for the largest possible representation of large and small and very small political parties, thus creating a situation of instability within municipal councils. Referenda, instability in municipal councils, allowing people to express themselves indeed may be understood as elements of enriching democracy. On the other hand, both these developments clearly curb the efficiency that democracy also needs in order to survive. Also, we have in Greece, but not in Portugal, the post-election persecution of the parliamentary opposition, very well-known cases of attacking opposition politicians. The peak of this was in February 2010, when 2 former prime ministers and 8 former government ministers were for 1 month held responsible by a criminal investigation that was finally aborted in the Greek parliament. There was also a government attempt between 2015 and 2016 to control the media, to allow only for 4 licenses for private media to exist. This expressed government hostility towards private media after 2015, and it was finally struck down by the highest administrative courts in Greece. We also have other populist measures, for example, the overnight upgrading of Greek technological education institutes, the TEI, which were raised immediately through just a law to the level of universities without any evaluation, and the massive recruitment of governing party supporters, 62,000 more civil servants in 2018 than in earlier years, and the government politicization of the top layers of public administration and public sector. So there was a large increase of the political appointees, by which I mean appointees at the top echelons of ministries and public agencies. Let me not be misunderstood. Traditional mainstream parties in this country, Greece, used to massively appoint their supporters to different levels of the public administration. What I'm suggesting to you is that this tendency was repeated by a populist party, Syriza, and perhaps regarding the fixed term or temporary civil servants, this rose to really very high proportions. So did the populist party achieve a better social situation for the Greeks? Not necessarily. If you compare Greece and Portugal regarding unemployment rate and poverty and social exclusion, in these years, which are comparable, you'll see that before the rise of populists to power and after the rise of populists to power, you have small differences. Unemployment fell from 27% to 24%. If you look at the right-hand side of your screen, poverty remained the same. However, in Portugal, we had somewhat better performance under the socialist government, which was in power in Portugal, along with the center-left party, the radical left party bloc. And then in terms of the other countries in Southern Europe, you see again that Greece in the year 2017 continued being the country in which the poverty and social exclusion rate was the largest. And unemployment rate had, of course, in Greece declined, but not as much in the rest of countries. And here are my conclusions. Long-term legacies of state-society relations in Greece were important to understand the rise of populism. The economic crisis was only a critical juncture. It allowed for the rise in populism in Greece, but not in Portugal. There was reform convergence in both countries, but the outcomes were different. The Greek governments were unsuccessful, both the governments of mainstream traditional parties and the populist government after 2015. And the outright rejection of austerity in Greece was combined with the rise of populist parties in our country. Greece emerged out of the crisis 4 years after Portugal did. Greece was late to emerge out of the crisis. The government turnover in Portugal in 2015 signaled the start of a recovery. That was the recovery of the Portuguese economy. It was not the case in Greece. The implementation of populist government policies was unsuccessful and probably to an extent threatening to some institutions such as the judiciary or the mass media. To sum up, legacies of party system polarization, labor mobilization, and political distrust explain the difference between Greece and Portugal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitri, for this very interesting paper on a topical and very much discussed issue. The paper discusses populism and party politics in the context of the economic crisis by comparing two countries of the European South, Greece and Portugal. It contributes to the literature of the conceptualization of the phenomenon of populism by delving into the highly relevant case of Greece, which experienced populism in the spectrum of both opposition and government. So the main argument and thesis that Dimitris brings into discussion is that beyond the ideology, style, strategy, or a relation between the leader and the led, populism should be theorized for the policies advanced when its representatives come to power. Dimitris maps a common set of populist governmental policies, the distrust towards checks and balances in liberal democracies, the colonization of the state, clientelism in public sector and welfare policies, and economic nationalism and protectionism, as well as a skepticism towards the common currency, the euro. And he examines how those are applied in the Greek case. And then the paper also contributes by outlining three main elements at the macro or the historical level that constitute the breeding ground for populism in Greece, which presents substantial differences with the case of Portugal, but also Spain to a certain extent. So the first is political exclusion or lack of political inclusion. The second are the legacies of state-society relations and political culture. And the third is the parameter of polarization. So regarding polarization in the party system, Dimitris emphasizes how populism can benefit from it, which is correct. But in the case of Syriza and ANEL, which is analyzed in the paper, is polarization a cause of populism or rather an effect of it? Both populism and polarization pre-existed to the crisis, even though in terms of policy making, New Democracy and PASOK did not differ much with respect to their core governmental choices before the crisis. So it seems to me that we need to empirically disentangle the link between populism and polarization and delve further into the arrow of this causality. And towards this end, I wonder whether the levels of two-partyism is a good indicator of polarization, especially given the fact that polarization in Greek politics reached its peak in 2015, when two-partyism was not at its highest levels, though. Then Dimitris' research shows that despite the little room for maneuver that the Greek populist government of 2015 to 2019 had, due to the close scrutiny of the foreign creditors, populism in government materialized via policies in the media, the judicial system, clientelistic appointments in both ministries, and the public sector at large. I found this section of the paper particularly interesting and well documented, systematizing important data backing the arguments. So the government of Syriza and ANEL manipulated their institutional leeway and indeed tried to scapegoat the media, whilst at the same time tried to create their partisan ownership in media outlets and interfere to the judiciary in various latent and manifest ways that the paper shows. So what I find particularly interested is in the way that populism affects democracy is that even though this took place in quite an emblematic way, the fact that pre-existing trust was very low in all those institutions anyway, it didn't seem to affect citizens' evaluations against Syriza or ANEL on the matter. Furthermore, I think that Dimitris' paper invites us to further think on what is the blueprint of the populist governments on the party and the political system as a whole, given that both Syriza and ANEL marked a severe defeat in the last parliamentary elections. And then a new leadership model by the current government seems to mark high acceptance in the polls, stirring levels of trust which long have been in decline in this country. Lastly, I will close my comments with two questions. Could one argue that the only way for populism to be defeated in practice is via government? And then, is populism in power dangerous for democracy after all, or is it just another governmental experience? So, Dimitris, if you want to comment on what I said, or in the meantime, if there are questions, feel free to place them in the Q&A space.
Shall I try to answer briefly to the very interesting commentary offered by Professor Rori right now? Yes? Okay, so thank you for the comments. I seriously take the suggestion that in my work, the concepts of polarization and populism should be much further disentangled. And I would like in another version of the same paper to document the fact that unless you have polarization, you cannot easily have populism. So populism is a vital part, polarization is a vital part of the explanation. The fact that there was a two-party system in Greece by itself does not explain that populism would arise anyway. There are other democracies, as we know, in which two-party systems have survived for a long time. What sets Greece apart from other European democracies, however, are at least two elements. One is, I believe, the very high electoral share which the two parties used to obtain and still actually today do so. Or in the last elections of July 2019, the two parties which came first and second obtained a quite large share of the electorate. But that would not be enough to explain the rise of populism. One had to see what kind of parties are those two contenders uh, of power. And in Greece, in contrast to other European democracies, we have two major parties which more than once have been very starkly opposed on ideological terms, not in terms of divergence regarding public policy X or public policy Y. We have parties which, at least nominally, profess to uh, represent two different worldviews, and this is very difficult to find in other European democracies. Let me remind you that in the period of the economic crisis in our parliament, we had political parties which supported the Nazi ideology and also the Stalinist communist ideology. Um, these are parties which you do not easily find in other European democracies. But the fact, of course, that there are such parties and are free to wage their electoral campaigns may be a positive sign, a sign that Greek democracy is more tolerant than other European democracies because it allows such a very wide expression of political opinions all the way from Nazism to Stalinism. I hope this is considered to be a positive point. I'm not sure. On the other hand, how to defeat populism? It is not possible to defeat populism just by supporting a party which is not populist. Non-populist parties from time to time indeed themselves espouse populist rhetoric, the populist rhetoric. For example, vehement uh, personalistic attacks against the leader of the other party. For example, the supply of equal benefits to a very large number of citizens, regardless of whether these citizens have differences such as different socioeconomic status or other social and economic characteristics. So populism is known for trying to cover as much large as possible a part of the population and offer to everyone the same thing, the same outcome, the same benefit. And some non-populist governments in this country and other countries have also espoused such populists. So the key to defeat populism is to build strong institutions which would be outside the epicenter of the political party conflict. Regulatory authorities, mass media which cannot be easily be touched by incoming governments, a judiciary which should be much more alien to the day-to-day running of politics in a country compared to what is happening today, and so on and so forth. Is populism dangerous? Populism is not dangerous with regard to the fact that it poses the correct questions. There are, particularly in the end of the 20th century, in the beginning of the 21st century, many instances in which non-populist parties have neglected the needs of vast strata of the population, large segments of the population, and there was no one to express these needs. For example, the need for a more comprehensive welfare system, or the need to, for instance, provide people with good and certainly more equal access to a public healthcare system. So populism is not dangerous as far as it poses the correct questions, and it certainly has done so. Populism may become dangerous if left unrestrained by these liberal institutions found in contemporary democracies, which are meant to depoliticize some sectors or institutions of society. For example, the ones we mentioned, mass media, the judiciary, regulatory authorities, and so on and so forth. If populism is able, or in fact any other political ideology, to grasp and grab all the elements of a liberal democracy, then populism may become dangerous.
Thank you, Dimitris. So The first three questions that we have are of David Blackman, who is former director of the British School, and he used to work in the European Union before he became director some time ago. So David asks on Greece, what is the explanation for the decline of independent Greeks and the Golden Dawn and its result? And whether there is anything new in clientelism in Greek politics. And the third one is what is the importance of the existence of Stalinist communist parties in both countries, Portugal and Greece? I can repeat them if you need, Dimitri. So the first is about the decline of independent. Okay.
Thank you very much. So Independent Greeks was a party that was basically short-lived party in Greek politics, exactly because it sprang out of the crisis. It was a party that did not have a distinct ideology. It was a party that consisted of former members of the center-right or conservative party of New Democracy. Its basic claim was that it would represent those conservative voters who were against austerity. It did not have a fully laid out political program on most other public policy fields, and it was particular Euroscepticism, and it is vehement anti-austerity stance that let it become a coalition partner of Syriza. As soon as the economic and social problems of Greece became more complicated in the period 2015 and until 2019, when a third memorandum of understanding had to be implemented, that party did not have much else to offer, given that it was built, so to speak, on a negative stance. It was against the New Democracy Party, and it was against austerity. It did not have much to offer regarding other public policy fields, except, of course, for its opposition to the resolution of the issue of the name of North Macedonia, which was a major issue, but compared to the economic problems of the country, it had become a less important issue. Golden Dawn, after 2013, when its leaders and also some of its rank and file were implicated in the assassination of radical left-wing singer, Mr. Fissas, declined rapidly. The party was understood as something else than simply a party. It was understood as a group of organized people who could use violence, naked violence, against political opponents and who had troubles with the law. So as the years passed and the trial against these party leaders and those who were implicated as assassins or accused assassins of Fissas, the party lost popularity and declined, and was to an extent only replaced by which obtained only 3% of the total vote in the last elections. Other party, which not be called neo-Nazi, is the party titled Greek Solution. Clientelism was present in Greece in different phases of Greek history, as you very well know. The difference of Syriza and ANEL compared to the previous situation is the following. Before Syriza and ANEL came to power, there were some political appointments by the previous coalition government of New Democracy and PASOK, but generally, owing to fiscal constraints, the Greek public sector had shrunk between 2010 and 2015. After 2015, we have an emergence of this tendency to hire not so much permanent civil servants, but the easily amenable type of civil servant, which we call temporary public employee. And between the years 2015 and 2019, there was a 55% increase in the number of these temporary or fixed term employees, which do not have to be hired through regular public administration and they're hired on a short-term basis, and then they are hired again and again, particularly on the basis of their political affiliation with the governing party. So there was a sharp increase in hiring such temporary or fixed-term employees, and there was a very high increase also in the number of politically affiliated appointees, councils of or advisors of ministers, special secretaries, general secretaries, and other members of politically appointed bodies at the top of public administration in the public sector, at the top of various state institutions, a practice which to an extent had already been curbed for a while before 2015. The fact that we have in Portugal and Greece two parties which look alike, the Portuguese Communist Party and the Greek Communist Party, is significant. But in Portugal, that party is much more, let's say, willing to offer some support to a coalition government, such as the previous coalition government, not the current, but the previous coalition government of Antonio Costa. So in contrast, again, to the case of Portugal, in Greece, the Greek Communist Party never accepted to offer any kind of support in any of these governments which succeeded one another in power over the last 10 years. So both may be termed old-fashioned traditional communist parties, but the Portuguese, let's say, was more open to the possibility not of participating in government, but support by a left-wing government. Thank you.
Okay, we have one last question and rather a comment, I think. So the question from Iakovos Spetsios is whether methodologically it is possible or correct to take into account the factor of education in the analysis of populism, comparing Greece and Portugal. And then there is a question from Nicholas Jeffrey on the basis of a nation with a strong two-party system, with two parties ideologically opposed, whether this gives the rise to populism. And Nicholas refers to the case of the UK in the current elections, where the two main parties took 86% of the vote and have ideological basis in clear opposition to each other, and which is the role of trust in public institutions. So I guess that the comment is to emphasize the role of trust as an important factor. So if you want to maybe briefly comment on those two questions, because we ran out of time. We have something like 2 minutes. We can extend a little bit, but yes, thank you.
Education itself cannot be used methodologically in such an analysis, but the thrust of educational policies of party X versus party Y indeed can be used. So if party X says that the prime aim of education policy is to offer opportunity for tertiary level education to all people, regardless of the type of education they receive, theology or engineering, regardless of the type of education they receive, that is a populist aim of educational policy. That we do not want to find out what are the synergies or what are the interfaces between education and the economy. We just want all people to obtain a university degree. That is a clear populist type of educational policy. It has been followed by many governments before Syriza and ANEL, and to an excessive degree, I think, in the case of Syriza and ANEL. Regarding the ideological opposition that Mr. Jeffrey has noted, yes, there is such an ideological opposition in Britain, and indeed, you have very wisely indicated that percentage shares of the vote of the two largest political parties were probably higher or have been higher in countries other than Greece. But problem is what kind of ideological polarization we have. In Greece and very few other countries, you have ideological polarization in the beginning, actually in the second decade of the 21st century, which is reminiscent of the ideological polarization you had before the Second World War in the 20th century. We still, and perhaps you don't know this, but in universities, in Greek universities, we still discuss the negative and positive aspects of various political ideologies, communism of the Stalinist kind, or we discuss the overthrow of liberal democracy. I mean, we don't discuss them as part of the material to be taught, but these are points brought into the seminars, and then an ideological discussion starts. I'm not sure that in Britain, in most British universities, you discuss the overthrow of capitalism, or that you discuss the possibility of replacing Stalinism, replacing liberalism with Stalinism. I think, with a few exceptions, in Britain, these issues have been downplayed over time. There are a few questions which I see at my chat group column. Golden Dawn Ilias Kassidiaris' party would pursue extreme populist, but also neo-Nazi policies. Okay, in the study of right-wing populism, which is not part of my discussion, we classify right-wing populist parties in different subcategories, and the Greek Nazi party, the Golden Dawn, along with the Ataka party in Bulgaria and the Jobbik party in Hungary, were a class on its own, not simply a neo-Nazi, military organization which took the form of parties.
So thank you, Dimitri. I think we are done with the comments.